up where we left off. So we're going to be in Matthew chapter 5, beginning with verse 13. But I want to spend just a couple seconds kind of reviewing a little bit our speed round through the Beatitudes. I think as we think about what the Beatitudes are, it's really a call to be different. And each of the Beatitudes is somewhat of a reversal of kind of what the world would typically expect, right? You have someone who is poor in spirit or mourning over things, or meekness and hungering and thirsting for righteousness, being merciful, being pure in heart, being peacemakers. But I think the key thing that I want us to focus on, they all center around this idea of being blessed or being approved by God. It's not a status of wealth or prestige or power, but it is a shift in one's own heart with a focus and orientation towards God, not towards self. So it's interesting too, as you kind of look at it a little bit further, kind of at a higher level, you see this kind of a progression from mourning over one's sin and the humility aspect of that, to righteous living and mercy, and ultimately to enduring persecution for God's sake. So as we shift from this really kind of these character-based things, the title I kind of put out for the lesson this morning is Living Beatitudes Out Loud. Instead of them being kind of something that we keep to ourselves or keep inside of our own kind of small circle, there's things that we show to the world. I think as we look at both of these being light and salt, we'll see these both really kind of highlight that. Has anyone ever been to Mammoth Cave? Yeah, right next door, right?
Yeah, go Kentucky.
I can remember going there as a kid, I don't know, 12, 13, 14 years old. And you go and you're kind of taking the little tours, and I assume this is kind of their normal thing, but at one point they just turn all the lights off. Everything. You can't see. They're like, hold your hand in front of your face, and you're like, I can't see anything. Nothing. Zero light. And then the tour guide or the ranger person, he lights a small little match. And the whole room begins to glow. That's the power of light. I think that's the power of difference that Jesus is really pulling upon here. Is sometimes we find ourselves in dark spaces, places that we're unsure of. You've ever been to somewhere where you don't live there, and you're staying with somebody, you're in the middle of the night, and you have to go to the bathroom, and like, I'm kind of fumbling around in the dark. Fortunately, we all have a phone that we can just kind of use our flashlight. But without light, we bump into things, we feel uncertain. But with that light, we can see things. Everything kind of changes. The one small amount of light transforms fear and uncertainty into positive and knowledge and knowing and a path forward. Well, the world that we live in today is kind of dark, right? It's there's a lot of confusion. Everyone seems to be kind of, this is the right way to do things. But there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of moral darkness. I think the day that Jesus lived too, they're really the same way, right? You had these Pharisees and Sadducees and religious leaders that are like very dogmatic on this is how it should be and this is how you're supposed to go. But was that really the right way. And so Jesus in verses 13, there he says, you are the salt of the earth. It's interesting, the first 12 verses there, we see these general principles and these beatitudes and the understanding of these character aspects of what it means to be approved by God. And then he really focuses it and says, you. Making it very, very personal. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Jesus had just come off describing what a heart of a person should be. It should be humble. They should be broken over their sin. They should be hungry for righteousness. They should be pure. They should be peace-seeking. Now he's saying, don't just live like this quietly, but go out into the world and make a difference. Use those character attributes that I want you to live, but go and make a change in the world around you. I think it's interesting too, Jesus is not asking people to be powerful or famous or wealthy or have all these things to make a difference. He's asking them to just be faithful. Because if we really think about it, these character principles bring clarity and conviction and ultimately hope into a world that is filled with confusion and darkness and uncertainty. So I think as we think about the Beatitudes or kind of these aspects, these character principles of our heart, I think being salt and being light really are all about their impact and their outward impact into the world. And God isn't asking for us to, we'll talk about this in a minute, but like live in a little monastery or compound, and that'd be kind of fun, personally, I think. So we all just get a few acres and we all live in one little spot. But that's not what God wants us to do. He wants us to be out in the world and to show His power and glory and mercy to the world around us. Why salt? Verse 13 says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? Is it no longer good for anything except for to be thrown out and be trampled under men's feet? Why salt? Good.
Well, I was just gonna comment on your introduction to this verse and why God, I think, calls, directs it towards us. And I think it's because, we were created in His image and we're supposed to be image barriers of His likeness. And so I think that's why He directs it towards us, because we're His, basically, supposed to be representing Him while we're here on earth. And I guess the interesting thing about salt that I just thought of is salt, and I could be wrong, I'm not a chemist, but salt never goes bad. So if you think about, God tells us to, that we're the salt of the earth, I mean, that's everlasting. That just goes on and on and on. And that's how we're supposed to be.
Any other thoughts? Why does Jesus bring up salt? What was salt used for in Jesus' day?
Well, preservative is one of the things, so,
Yeah.
like, where Maria was headed with it, I thought, is, wouldn't we be doing that, preserving God's word through our lives?
Absolutely. That's the first one I put up there, right? We can kind of get into the food science on why salt works. That'd be kind of boring for y'all. But it works really well. And it was a thing where there's no refrigerator, freezer, etc., right? If you had food that you wanted to keep for a long time, especially meat products, without rotting, you needed to put a lot of salt onto those things to make it stay and make it last for a long time. It prevented decay, and it became this necessary staple in everybody's life. So it becomes something that everybody had, and you had to have it if you wanted to preserve anything. Flavor, right? My mother-in-law, one of her favorite verses is the parallel passage in Luke where it starts off, salt is good. But it provides flavor, it brings out the best qualities. It doesn't necessarily make it food better, but it brings out the natural qualities of that food and enhances the taste of that food tremendously. And I think this also, to your point, salt is very permanent. It's also it can be very pure, but I think we're going to talk about one of the things that causes problem is when that purity gets contaminated, the potency of that salt gets lessened. I think it's interesting if we look back in the Old Testament in both Leviticus chapter 2 and verse 13 and Numbers chapter 18 and verse 19, it's this association with holiness in the covenant. There's an absence of leaven, so you're taking something out. But in all these sacrifices it says, and put salt with the sacrifice. It's also a reminder of the permanence of God's covenant. He's like, why do I put this salt in there? Because to remind you of the permanent covenant I have with you. And why you are a special people and called out. It's actually interesting too, and I think it's 2 Chronicles. It's relating back to David's ascension to the throne, and there is a notion of salt was used as a confirmation or saying, hey, this person, David, will be on the throne forever. And by using salt, it's just kind of highlighting this permanence of that relationship that God has and God is putting forward. But what are the lessons we need to have? From a preservation standpoint, we need to have an influence on kind of this rotting world. 1 John 2 and verse 15 talks about how the world is passing away. The world is not something that's permanent. This world is not something that's going to last forever. We shouldn't hang our hat on that. But in looking at it, we need to show and make ourselves to be different. The passage in Romans there, Paul paints a kind of a fairly grim picture of what the world is. Society is kind of suppressing the nature and the goodness of God out of really a love for the evil that they kind of seek after. But the world, it deteriorates. The values and the standards of the world continue to slip away until it becomes more and more corrupt. So how can we be an influence in a world that is continuing to kind of slip away and to fall into disrepair and to look further and further away from God's will? In John 17 and verse 15, this is where I think we can't live isolated lives. This is Jesus in this kind of final prayer to his Father, and he says there in verse 15, kind of taking a quick snapshot in here, I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but you keep them from the evil one. One of the books I was reading has this little thought around this. It's like salt can't be just kept in the shaker. It'd be really easy and fun to just kind of hide in a little corner and be all to ourselves. And Jesus is asking us though to be salt, to be out there and living in a way that is acting as a way to change the world. Right? I think it's how might we live in a way that reflects God's greatness? And in a world that is continuing to, you look at all the things in Romans chapter 1 there, 21 through that's supposed to be 31, by the way. And at the end of that chapter, it's a picture of the world in the first century, in the Roman times, and the influence that the Roman kind of mindset had kind of put on it. It's interesting. It's like, that could be 2025 pretty easily. So I think, what in our lives are we doing to influence the rotting world? What are the things that we live and say and do daily that can kind of become an influence out there? What does our social media posts say? What does our casual conversations of people at work say? We'll get into this in a little bit. Go ahead, Morgan.
I wasn't sure if you were asking or not, but
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a friend, Jordan. We worked together at my last job, and then this job, and then now he's working for himself, and he moved out to Denver. And he's the kind of person who has tried everything, and is just trying to like fix himself basically. And it's just all like coming up short. And recently he like started looking for a church and is like going to consider God. And I feel like we can influence people just by like staying in their life and showing them like the peace we have, and that we do have the answers, and that when they're ready they can come to us. But I think just by being patient with people and keeping that bridge built, and not like letting it crumble is just so important. And sometimes you can't like see the light at the end of the tunnel, but you just never know like what those relationships can turn into and who you're influencing or what they're picking up on. But being a friend to someone, just like being steady in their life, can just really influence them, and then hopefully turn into like them seeking the Lord. So that's from my personal experience, but I know there's like hundreds of other ways you can do it.
Thanks, Morgan. I think that's interesting too, is we look at salt, and we talked about the kind of the purity of salt. Salt, sodium chloride, doesn't go away. But Jesus says, but if the salt has lost its taste, what do you guys think that means? Kind of put a few things up there. Brennan?
I think that kind of connects back to the flavor. If you're not bringing out the goodness in others and making a positive impact, then you're not having that taste.
Yeah. I think if we're not willing to use our influence, listen.
Well, the interesting thing, during Jesus' time, there was salt, but then they had these things that acted very, very, very similar to salt. So when Jesus is talking how salt doesn't lose its flavor, there are things that people used that if they didn't have salt, they used this stuff that was salty. So that's what he's talking about, is like, salt doesn't lose its flavor. You shouldn't lose your flavor. Don't be fake salt, in essence.
Yeah. Linda?
I was thinking that how if you add additives to salt, that they can cause the salt to deteriorate. So I'm wondering if like we're supposed to be in the world but not part of the world. So if you add too much of the things of the world to your life instead of keeping yourself separate and pure, then that's gonna cause the salt in a sense to deteriorate because it's had these other additives to it.
It loses its potency, it loses its ability to do its job in that preservation aspect. And can really it's interesting, all of the food laws that we have today were really generated out of kind of the 1900s, and people would, there really was a bit of a wild, wild west, and people would kind of do weird things in an attempt to just make money. And so there was milk and things like that, like they would figure out chemicals that they could put in the milk to just make it last forever. But it really wasn't good at all. Same thing with salt. I think it's that 2 Corinthians passage is really kind of something I wanted to look at a little bit. If the world wants us to align with them, this is do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? It's the world wants us to be like them, and it's exactly like that. It's adding kind of contaminants to our salt. The word there kind of like lose your taste. The Greek word, kind of you dig behind it a little bit, is really an aspect of it's about foolishness. It's used 3 or 4 different times in the New Testament, but it's the foolishness. And so it's this thing that's like, it should be good. This salt that you're using should be good. It maybe looks good, but if it doesn't do its job because it's kind of lost its taste, it's got contaminated with other things, its influence is detrimental to what its purpose is, it's good for nothing. Just throw it out, start over, throw it on the street. So we as disciples need to guard our influence. We need to guard our actions. We need to guard our speech. We're going to talk about this. Like, if we go to somebody and try to act as a preserving or influence in their life, but they're like, by the way, you were just kind of hanging out and doing things you probably shouldn't. Why are you telling me to be different? But then I see kind of your life is sort of not really different. It's different sometimes. Put the Christian hat on. I'm like, oh, hold on, I need to put the Christian hat off for a minute. Jesus says the word useless, good for nothing, to be trampled underfoot. So how we need to be an influence, be a preserving element, be consistent. How do we find the balance of kind of being in the world so we can be an influence, but not allowing the world to be in us? Adam?
I don't know that I have the answer, but I just think about how Jesus tried to ready his followers up front. The world will hate you. The world will not understand you. This is how they treated me. This is how they're going to treat you. And it seems like the more that we can just understand it's my job to be different, and that's not always going to be popular, and that's not going to be accepted. Like, I feel like I've worked for a long time to try to get that through my head, and it still doesn't always work because your instinct is just to want to fit in and to want to be liked and to want to be well received. But I think there's at least something to knowing up front, like, if I'm doing it right, then it's gonna stick out like a sore thumb, and that's just part of it.
Jim?
I was going to say, if you look at Jesus' life, it's kind of, and what he said, sometimes he was very loving, he was very forgiving, and sometimes he was hard to get along with. And there's probably no one answer. We have to love, but sometimes we got to be a little bit hard to get along with if the world is violating our Christian code.
I was just gonna add to that, one of the commentaries talks about concentration of salt. And so if you think about that salt is a purifying, right, it's a preservative. But then the amount of salt, the more we have, it creates thirst. And so there's kind of this concept or principle, to your point, of how do we make sure that we don't lose our taste? How do we make sure that we live in a way in the world? I think it's concentration of salt, right? And the more we get of it, the more we thirst, the more we, it's kind of that cyclical concept.
Yeah, I think refinement and purity and making sure that we don't let those influences come into our life to disrupt us. Other hand, Andrew?
You asked a question earlier, like why salt, right? Salt has a purpose. I think you've listed out what those purposes are here. one of the things is our purpose is to not be part of the world. And I think Adam took some of what I was gonna say, but I would add to it and say, when you taste salt, you don't mistake what salt tastes like. And so, when the world tastes salt, it's not necessarily something that is sweet. So we do have to be and be prepared to be different. Because we do have a purpose. We are the salt of the world. We are the purpose of the world. And so I think we need to remember that and understand that, you know, to just be a little maybe funny about it. I don't want to be funny about it, but it's like we have to let our flag fly. And we need to say, this is who we are. But we need to take our flag and we need to drive it into the ground and say, we've claimed this. And that's who we are.
And I think not letting the world overwhelm us, the way we do that is surrounding ourselves in equal, if not greater parts with Christians and gathering with our church family and being in the Word so that you don't get a disproportionate amount of the world and the world influence in your life. You need to be being built up by people who are also salt and like-minded so that you have the strength to face that persecution that Adam was talking about.
And Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 12, about not being conformed to the world, but being transformed. And I think it's interesting, he says there, renew your mind, right? How do we renew our mind? He says, by testing and discerning. I think to your point too, is like, let's have people in our lives that help us, to refine us, to help us as we live our lives, to help be a positive influence on us, so we don't kind of get diluted out. I think it's interesting too is sometimes maybe is as we're trying to be different, this notion of needing to balance truth and grace, and we kind of, sometimes we can maybe be too salty, I don't know. But understanding kind of the balance and the influencing that we can have and the notice that, to Stuart's point, we do need to be different, but I think and sometimes we need to make sure we manage that influence properly and make sure that we are reflecting those things together. Let's move to the second one. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill can't be hidden. I think just like salt was very kind of a different spot in Jesus' day, kind of light was too, right? You think about the advantages we have in the 2025 with really, it's hard to be dark in a lot of ways. You've got a flashlight in your pocket. But we see this idea of what does it mean to be light? I think in the time of Jesus, you had these small oil-based candles or lamps that they would use in their house. And I think we see parables and things like that of like, hey, the wise and foolish virgins, they needed to have oil in their lamps so they could know where to go and how to go and when to go at the right time in a world of darkness. And when the sun went down, it was really dark. And so they needed a way to kind of reveal the way. In Psalm chapter 119, 105, it says, your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. I think the other thing is, what light does is it exposes the darkness. It kind of chases the darkness away. But also kind of this idea of, think of a lighthouse, right? It's kind of saying, hey, watch out. There's danger here. But it's also like, it's a guide and a constant so somebody can see and look. So let's go and turn to Philippians chapter 2. Look at a few of these passages here. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 15, start off with 14 there. It says, do all things without grumbling and disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. I think this notion of we need to be those that make a difference and change. In Ephesians chapter 5, we've been studying that. It talks about we need to be true to our guiding principles. This idea that we need to walk as children of light. And Paul talks to them, he's like, hey, don't hang on to those past things you did. Don't walk the way that the Gentiles are. But this notion of the truth and the reality of the change that you have made in your life, walk true to that. Let's take a look. Ezekiel chapter 22 is a really, really good spot where we can see kind of a little bit of kind of both this idea of salt and of light. In Ezekiel chapter 22, if you go all the way to the beginning of the chapter, we see this is a view and a look of total dysfunction in the nation of Israel. The people who are in charge, or should be kind of leading and guiding and acting as lights for the nation, have completely abandoned their job. In fact, they have become kind of the enemy. They've become the ones that steal and loot and continue to degrade the country and utilize people inappropriately. And at the end there in verse 30, it says, I sought for a man, this is God speaking to them. I sought for a man among them who should build up the wall, to stand in the breach before me in the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found none. Therefore I've poured out my indignation upon them. I've consumed them with the fire of my wrath, and I've returned their ways upon their head, declares the Lord God. God is saying, I'm looking for somebody to stand up and make a difference. The wall is all broken down. There's a big hole in it. The enemies could just run right in. I'm looking for somebody to stand in the middle of that hole to stop the enemy from coming in. Somebody to stand up and make a difference, to be a light in a really dark spot. He's like, I didn't find anybody. We kind of live in a world similar to that, where there's a lot of brokenness and broken walls that we probably could find areas to stand up and be a light in. Jesus said that we are the light. I think in the beginning of the Gospel of John, John chapter 1, John chapter 1, beginning of verse 5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about that light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to bear witness about that light. Jesus says, you're the light. But ultimately, we're not the source of that light. But we are bearing witness, just like John the Baptist here. We are vessels carrying that light to the world. And we find ourselves in a spot where our lives are those visible representations, right? The city set on a hill is visible from all around. This notion of being a lighthouse in a spot where we shouldn't be hiding our lives. We need to live our faith openly and humbly, as a way to show the world. I think it's also like, our light is not meant to bring glory to us, but to give glory to God. think this is one where it's really easy, and I think the world would say, hey, in many cases, I don't care. I don't want to see what you've got to show me. I think that shouldn't discourage us. I think this is an idea where, okay, moving on. I think that's something that in the world we live today is the discouragement we can get by people kind of like, here we go again.
I kind of think it's that we got it so good today that we don't need God, in a sense. And I found that when most people are going through tough things, you mention it to them, and they mention the foxhole prayer, and that's what people are, but I just, we have it too good today compared to back to them times to where we don't need God. And that's kind of why he tells us that, we need to go through trials and temptations and need him, like he said, broken spirit. We need to break our spirit down. Know that he's in charge.
Yep.
Know where everything comes from.
So, are there ways that sometimes we hide our lights today? What's that look like?
I think busyness gets in the way a lot. I think we see opportunities to do good in times like, but we're just so busy that it's not our deal, it's not our responsibility.
Staying silent. Sometimes an opportunity presents itself in a conversation, and you could say something that may not be received very well, so it's easier to say nothing.
Like that's the one I find myself, it's like, and then the opportunity passes by. Or it's like, are they gonna take it the wrong way? I think both these get like a salt line.
I was thinking, just not having that relationship built in the first place. Like, you gotta have a bridge to walk across. So you have to invest in people and make sure they know you care about their dog and about their hobbies and all those things. And then they wanna know you and why you're different.
Yeah. I want to do a little bit of what does it look like to put these things a little bit into practice. I think to your point, especially Margaret, sometimes we just need to try and do, and sometimes it's not this big grandiose thing. It's the little things that we built up that then, hey, when maybe there is a big thing, it's easy to talk to. But do we stand for truth when we see others compromising? I think that's even kind of even amongst ourselves, right? Do we hold each other accountable to what we should be doing? Are we willing to talk to each other and kind of being that positive influence, not just out to the world, but to ourselves together as fellow Christians, as a church family? What are we doing when we see others kind of compromising, kind of, Do we encourage godly conversation? And to your point, Morgan, is people shouldn't be surprised when we bring things up. Like our normal kind of conversation should be focused towards God. Here's one that sometimes putting the Beatitudes into practice, being peacemakers, forgiving others instead of retaliating. I think sometimes it's really easy to kind of like, all right, I'm done. And break off that relationship, or break off that influence that we might be able to repair. I wonder if someone sees us trying to make that extra effort and make that kind of olive branch extension to somebody that really wronged us, where we have every right to be angry and retaliate, but what if we offer forgiveness instead? Does the world see that as that's different? And what are we doing in our relationships? I think start close to home. Preserve our marriages, our friendships. You can kind of keep going. Different relationships do we have in our lives? We put our light into practice by sharing our faith. It's fine to be gentle, but we need to be clear. I think that's something that it's really easy to kind of water it down and like, I don't want to offend anybody. It's fine to be gentle, but I think we need to be very clear and like, this is right, this is wrong. This is why. This is what God's word has to say about being right and being wrong. I think we can open our homes and be this guiding influence, this lighthouse. I think people see then what happens in your house, like, wow, this is different. I know when we've had kids over, the friends from school come over and we all sit around the dinner table and then say a prayer and have dinner together. I think must have been in Texas, but it was like, well, this is different. We don't ever sit around the table and just like have dinner together. Something like, that's normal. But it was, some of the kids that came over were just kind of like completely shocked. They're like, you do this almost every night? Like, yeah, we just grab Whataburger and go to our rooms. I'm like, okay. But open your home to somebody to just show them a different way. It doesn't have to be something perfect, and this is not like a big grandiose thing. We're just having dinner. This is the big one. Do we seek out people that maybe are kind of ignored by the world and show them compassion and give them a positive influence? I think that's something that we ourselves need to live our own lives visibly, right? This city said we need to be joyful. We need to live with integrity. We need to be at peace with others. Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its taste, how shall the saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Salt is a way where we can preserve and influence and show the world what it means to be a follower of Christ. Light means we need to live our lives openly, brightly, not hidden, guiding everybody back towards God. So I think as we kind of finish up this morning, I just want us to think about these two aspects are really asking us to take those beatitude concepts and to not just kind of keep them inside of ourselves, but to live those things in a way that we live out loud. A pure heart, from verse 8, says, hey, we give clarity to the light that we are showing from our pureness of heart. Peacemakers helps us to shine our lights into maybe divided or broken spaces. God calls us not to blend in, but to stand out, to live these attributes out loud in a way that would bring glory to Him. Next week, we're going to talk about this idea of the law being fulfilled. It's really challenging for the people listening to that, so we'll be kind of looking at why did they kind of hear that? And then what does that mean for us today? So thank you so much for your